Thanks a lot for inviting me over today. I thought it was very interesting what you just said about India, because it's actually same, different. And it's surreal how the same topics come up basically all over the world, and the specific solutions are totally different, are utterly different, and different tools to be developed, the same strategies maybe, but also always very, very different approaches. And I think that makes it very, very interesting. So I'm trying to drag you to another country far, far away, to Chile, before I drag you to another very exotic country, the Netherlands, which is very close. And why this is exotic, you're going to find out later. Actually, I want to start with a statement trying to make a point in the presentation where we actually learn from Chile rather than Chile learn from us. That is something I say looking back to 10 years project development, not in a financial sense, but in a developing sense, for a project in Chile I'm going to present you. But as you may know, in the last 30 years, more square meters had been built than in the previous 5,000 years before, and most of them without architects. The problem is clear. 1 billion people live under what we would call precarious conditions. They're lacking education, they're lacking accessibility to infrastructure, they're lacking accessibility to fresh water, sewage, gas, all sorts of infrastructure, social networks, and so on. Under the constant threat of eviction, it's pretty easy to imagine that it's pretty tough to build up something that we would maybe call a permanent future or a perspective, or something that kind of generates an extra value to an object, which is a piece of architecture that could be a building or a place to be, or, well, maybe that is the difference between a house and a home. Under these conditions, obviously, a building is much more than just an investment. And surprisingly enough, the uncertainties that come up with these structures, the uncertainties of permanency in these developments, leads to something which we found very astonishing in terms when it comes down to creativity. They're extremely creative, they're extremely sustainable, they're extremely intelligent in the way they treat space, in the way they treat material, in the way they use the things they found in place. So actually that is maybe a big difference to what we just saw, that actually in a lot of places we found a situation where the specific conditions of the site are a key to success for an affordability in housing schemes as well. So that social intelligence, or we could also call it urban intelligence, is something that, interesting enough, is hardly corresponded or worked on by planning departments, governments, educational institutions, universities, schools, architects, urban planners. It's still a pretty much neglected field of action. And in order to overcome this paralysis and to find strategies to close the gap between the necessities for the urban poor and the actual solutions that have been developed so far, the Chilean government came up with a competition in 2003, a brief that they developed together with the Ministry of Housing, the Ministry of Spatial Planning, the Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, Harvard University in Boston, the Universidad Católica de Santiago de Chile, the oil lobby, the copper lobby, basically all interest groups coming together here, trying to set a competition, an architectural competition, with a brief that would try to give every Chilean citizen a solid, a permanent house by the end of 2015. If such a diverse group of interest groups of, well, different ministries and financial bodies come up with such a simple formula, namely how to build 150 houses, one not bigger than 30 square meter for not more than $7,500 on a total plot that would not exceed 1 hectare. Then we thought, if that could be so easily formulated, our answer shouldn't be much more complicated than this. And this is actually all we did. We proposed a structure that was not just a supporting, load-bearing structure, but that combined structural issues with infrastructural issues. We provided a structure that took care of the basic needs: water, electricity, sewage. The basic needs would be held in a sort of backbone, these slabs you see, and in between these building slabs, the people themselves could kind of add up and integrate their own houses and build on that building. So actually it is a combined design project, if you want. It's actually not a ready-made design, but more a strategic design. A strategic design where we as architects just build a part of the house and the client, the future inhabitants, continues permanently to change, transform, to adapt the house. So there was no point zero where we actually could take photographs of the whole lot of our work, since by the time they did house 10, the first one, to be recognized again. So the times are, I mean, the speed of transformation is incredible in these areas. Anyway, the backbone of the house, the slab, that in the first three images, that comprised everything that's technically complicated. Ducting, wiring, stairs, kitchen, bathroom, front door, house number, very important, don't forget the house number. You cannot apply for electricity, you cannot have a mobile phone if you don't have a house number. So first of all, we had to give all these people's house numbers, because without this funny house number, you can't do anything. You do not exist. Actually, that's not only a Chilean problem, that's also a problem that applies to a lot of countries in Africa as well. A typical, I would say, slum problem. Anyway, the job of us, the architects, were the first three phases, let's say, of three images in the model, and then the inhabitants continued to work on the building. If you know that the average family in India was 6.3 people, in Chile it's 9.5 people. It comprises 3 generations, and the average square meter per family is 25 square meter today. So already increasing it to 30 square meter indicates what a big kind of progress that is, or would be. Needless to say that 3 generations, 9 people have different needs, different wishes, different necessities in how they use such a building structure, in how they cope with such a building, and in how they're gonna kind of explore it further. The only thing that was clear to us very, very quickly is one of the big problems of these neighborhoods is actually that there's no public space. Public space is swallowed up by formal developments, illegal developments for about 55%. That's also a funny distinguishing factor, actually. Informal development is not necessarily illegal development. But anyway, by introducing a 3-story high building structure, we kind of got the opportunity to generate space, extra space. Space that could be used for meetings, that could be used for collective festivals, that could be used to any kind of encounter where people could meet, sit together, eat together, or do whatever they want together. They could talk together. A space that we think is so absolutely natural to us, these semi-private spaces, but to them a totally new phenomena. Well, this is like the floor plan, what the floor plan would look like, very simple and straightforward. And then once we got inside for the first time, reality kicked in. We found out a lot of things that made us think and rethink our building structure. For example, this little device here, we always refer to it as Granny's stove. It's cast iron. Most of you may not even know it anymore. But it's actually a very, very smart device. It can warm water for washing. It is a central heating system. It can cook. It is a social point of encounter, of meeting. It's the central area in the house where the whole family comes together. And not unimportantly, it runs on everything you find on the street. This is a device that was a donation by a European company, providing the whole neighborhood with 5,000 of these gas cooking devices, which are still in use, funny enough, but not as a cooking device anymore, but as a CD rack, a shoe rack, some kind of storage. I mean, they all still have them somewhere outside their little huts, but you know, they're not used as a stove anymore. Why? Once the first bottle of gas is empty, there's no money to replace it, to refill it, and if you would have the money, you would not really easily walk that one to the next road, to the next bigger road like this, where maybe a gas man would come and sell you a refill. So actually, that is part of the reality we found in place, but also of the smartness of some of the traditions and devices we had. And according to this, we adapted the floor plan, I think about 120 times. Doesn't really matter. The structural principle stayed the same. And then when we first got on site, we kind of suffered under the same shock Anna probably had in India as well. I mean, we all know, but actually our project was growing overnight from 150 families to about 600 families, from 1 hectare to 6 hectare, including a primary school, a community center, and the whole thing was kind of exploding. And we thought, like, okay, where does this end, right? And I mean, what are we doing here? Is this kind of a repetitive and generic thing, or is this a very specific solution to that neighborhood? So we tried to get a foot on the ground, and with the first unit we proposed, all academics we talked to, they were totally sure this is the solution to go for. We are building for Mapuche Indians. Mapuche Indians are people from ground. They're soil connected, Mother Earth. They live on the floor. They would never without having. Okay, I mean, we can do that 50 times, but 500, 600 times, I have no idea. So we got a bit scared of our proposal. Coming up with the movement of this multifunctional room, we proposed as a starting unit, you can have that on the ground floor or on the first floor, which would have the advantage to dry firewood or store a stolen Ferrari, or, you know, I mean, you could use it for many, many ways. And obviously the third option would have that multi-room on the top floor, which provided a double high space underneath the building structure. In the end, actually, only 2 parties chose the last option. 95% choose that one, and a couple of them went for option 1. Why? Because obviously this space, which was actually independent of the building itself, it was just a leftover of the building. It was a consequence of the structure. That was such an extra value to them that they could dry their clothing, dry their firewood and all this, that it was so convincing to go for that option. Now, the work we did, my Spanish is appalling, I have to say, and Frederik's Spanish is even worse. So we were illiterates under illiterates, literally. And that was absolutely brilliant, because what we did is we worked in, I don't know how many sessions with about 1,500 people in groups, divided up in 10 groups, on their houses with little models, with sketches, and there was a very easy communication. It maybe took half a day to get used to us, for all of us, and then we were all sketching like mad. And we didn't know what we were talking about, but anyway, we were communicating through models and sketches. And that was a very, very interesting experience. And also from the social workers who kind of run a parallel program, a social program on that whole neighborhood, they kind of really pushed us into that kind of cluster work, literally. So getting these people divided up in little groups, together with our Chilean partners. This is Alejandro Aravena, a friend of mine, who with his office supported the project as well. And together we kind of worked on these like little clusters, 20 families together, surrounding this semi-private, semi-public space, and arguing about what that space could be used for, right? And that was really interesting to us. I mean, we were really worried about getting this stuff built. But once the design, once the principles were clear, everyone agreed on it. Okay. And then for months and months and months, we were arguing about gated communities. Should it be open? What if little neighborhood invests in a bench and they find it the next morning 2 blocks down the road? Because obviously, out of the construction principle that kind of led to this sort of courtyard situation, we derived the whole urban plan. And that is actually my point here, that normally when we talk about housing developments, slum transformation or upgrading processes, there's always the big idea of how the whole thing, how the whole neighborhood has to be transformed. And from that master plan idea, it's been broken down to little sections, parts of the plan, and from that plan, architecture is going to be derived. And here we did it the total opposite way. We started with a constructing principle of a house that led us to a little mini neighborhood, a cluster, and from that cluster idea, we developed a whole neighborhood. Now, I have to say that parts of this did not work. The part that did not work is we started for months, for about 7 or 8 months, we tried to develop the slum one-to-one. So we thought we could really leave the people in place, kind of moving them 5 meters, doing the first house, moving them in, doing the next house. That turned out not to work at all. That was a total failure. But what did work is actually the other side of the road. So they moved 500 meters. They are, if you want, relocated, but 500 meters. I don't know. We argue about that later on the bar, whether that is relocation or not. But anyway, they're pretty close to where they started off. Another point that is interesting when we talk about affordability is, and I'm going to show you 2 other projects, that it's like KPMG defines it, it's a generic term, right? We do not know, who do we address? Which is the target group? I mean, affordable housing for the rich one, or the middle class income, for the lower class income? What are we actually talking about? It's a totally useless term, if you think about it, right? This is clear, the target group were almost the poorest in the country. I say almost because this was not a 100% donation, even though there was a lot of American and World Bank money running into this project. This project had a self-contribution by the families of 150 euros. That would make them a saving, that saving of 150 euros would take them 7 years in average, okay? That already is like a distinction between that very, very poor group of people. Now, what did we do in order to not exclude the ones who could not even afford the 150 euros over 7 years? They got involved into the building process. Because in that neighborhood, we had an unemployment rate of 93%. we knew that a lot of these people had a pretty good education, craftsmanship education. There's a lot of forests around in that area, a lot of woodwork going on. And we did a deal with the contractor in the end that he would have to employ the people from that area to help building their own neighborhood. And that, of course, is something where the social workers mainly really jumped on and said, yeah, that's great, because that would be the issue, how we can actually tackle the problem of identification with such an area. Because the worst that could happen is that people move into the Dutch neighborhood, right? I mean, this is the worst that could happen. The best is if they move into their neighborhood. And that is what happened here. Like, people could work on a credit system on their own project, saving credit points with their own labor. So obviously, architecture and urbanism are very close to each other. Actually, this is our point, what Joachim also just said, they cannot be separated. And Anna just said it as well, that actually you cannot think one without the other scale. So this scale component and the whole issue, like where you stopped your presentation with, who does the city actually belong to, is an issue we argue a lot about in the office. And I don't have a solution, I don't have an answer to this. Who does the city belong to? Obviously not. But the debate in the office runs between two extremes. Is it an individual achievement, or is it a collective good? Right? Or in other words, is it mass customization, or is it custom made? And I want to present you another project addressing a totally different target group in the other exotic country a few miles from here. A project which is not in Rotterdam but in Leiden. It's maybe 10 miles, well, actually 20 miles north of Rotterdam. And a typical sort of reurbanization project. I mean, you all know these areas, the derelict areas from the industries of the 19th century, most of them train tracks. Stuttgart 21, Stuttgart 21 is one of these examples. Tempelhof, or in future, maybe not. Tegel would make up another such an area. Anyway, every city has these kind of transformation areas. So is the same case in Leiden. You see that the location, the site is just outside the old fortification line, the old canal and the fortress, the historical center. Leiden is one of the two major universities in the Netherlands, Delft for the technical part, and that one for all other studies. You see that also that the city has long kind of swallowed up the location. It's been grown around. So, central station here. This area, which had been totally neglected, is actually pretty central, and is actually a very unusual spot to develop houses in such a way the Dutch tried to do it here. Now, as you know, or probably know, the Netherlands are the densest country in Europe. 17 million people of about the surface of Hessen. I don't know what that in English is, but it's probably Hessen. I don't know. So, and funny enough, high-rise in the Netherlands is not too, I mean, it's maybe popular, but it's not too common. I mean, the Netherlands are famous for low-rise and high-dense building structures. And this is exactly what we did here. We tried to develop a plan that's actually drawn up by MVRDV, another Rotterdam office, and that suggested to give different blocks to different architects. Now what we did is actually, we sat together with some of our colleagues and said, okay, we split it up. We are not going to build one block each. We kind of mingle, we mix, we kind of do different sort of, like, try to make it a bit more colorful, maybe. And not all of the architects took part in this. The light gray ones, they're still developed by one architect, and the other ones, well, we decided to kind of cut it off and in loose pieces and reassemble it in a different way. Now, why we did this is actually because we thought that we have to come up with an alternative to the usual development of these city spaces. I mean, this is probably the last site in Leiden that's been available for the next 100 years of that scale. So it's very precious, actually. You know, it's not something you easily build on and that's it. So I don't know, we had the idea that this may be a way to bring a variety in that kind of mirrors the society of the town in the 21st century. Now, the tricky thing of that development was that, of course, there was a budget regulation, and the maximum building costs on all these projects were 1,050 euros per square meter, which is not an awful lot, just about above 1,000 euros. And the question actually is, if you address private clients together in a collective kind of group, because they develop something like this together, 18 parties back to back next to each other, building on a parking garage, on a collective parking garage, developing one big block, but still every develops a complicated process. And well, anyway, I mean, this is the principle of how we thought we could try to build the city in our times. And this density had a very architectural problem, or actually two consequences, namely the question of outdoor space and in the houses. Since the plots were so small, land is so expansive that the plots are very, very condensed and compact. So that we somehow had to deal with these two issues. And we made a prototype house for that. A prototype house that actually did exactly the same than the house in Chile. And I remember a lecture we gave about 3 or 4 years ago. Someone said, "Are you actually ever tried a floor plan? Or are you ever doing the same thing?" And we said, "Well, actually, we pretty almost do the same thing." You know, well, I mean, also here we put everything in one cupboard, right, in a service slab. We kind of cleaned the whole space, no partitioning walls. We only have one facade to light up the whole thing. So, you know, we need to kind of clean up the whole floor plan system in a way. And while doing though, so we had the chance to integrate double high spaces to the front that would allow daylight to come in deeper. We folded the floor, the roof a little bit up. That allowed us to meet the low energy standards, which also we had to fulfill since we kind of made this slab particularly heavy as a buffer that could accumulate warmth over day and release it during nighttime. It's a little bit the scheme you see here. And also by that folding roof, we interrupted the sight line of the roof garden from the street. So we disconnected the visual relations here in order to give that more the idea of a backyard rather than a front garden. And this is what it looks then today. Construction-wise, if you want to build for 1,050 euros a square meter, you have to come up with a prefabricated system in the Netherlands. I mean, the Netherlands anyway, they're dominated by serial housing structures, by serial housing developments. They have a big tradition in standardization. They have a very high level in standardization, which is an advantage on one side and has a clear disadvantage that there's hardly any craftsmanship left in the country, since these sort of building sites, you only need one person who actually knows what to do, and the rest is just uneducated workers. Okay? So even the simplest bricklayer is much higher educated than most people working on this side here, I have to say. This is how simple the whole thing is, and that is also why it's so cheap, right? So this is the price, actually, we have to pay here. And it's actually a pretty high price, I think, if you really think about it socially. But that's the situation in the Netherlands at the moment. Further to the materials, I'm going to drag you a little bit the manufacturing of the house. Most materials were far too expensive. They exceeded the budget by far. So we had a day trip to the port of Rotterdam where we saw a lot of industrial materials. And actually the waste products we kind of got for special rates, and we could kind of integrate them in this building. And part of that was the stretch metal. The stretch metal you see here is one material that is able to kind of resist damage from the outside. The building skin as such is made by PVC film and spray rubber. Okay, we stop here. This is going to be appalling. But anyway, cladded with this. And also, it's perfect in interiors. It's perfect because it works as a sound absorber in this double height space. It reflects the light a little bit deeper inside the building. It is used as cupboard doors, sliding doors, the kitchen behind here. You cover things, you open things, you connect spaces, you disconnect spaces. It's all done by that one and only material. The floor, just a concrete floor, coated PVC coating, €5 a square meter. The walls, just filmed, painted white. That's it. I mean, literally the most expensive things is actually this dead cow laying here, right? So there's one detail in the house that's special, that makes it very, very personal as well. It's a very rational timber stair. It's made out of oak, which is very costly, but it comes from an old tree the owners cut years and years ago, and they found in the shed of their parents. We kind of reused that old oak tree. So also here, there's a story why this pretty slim staircase is actually put into the building. What we actually try to do with all these 11 houses, I'm not going to show you more than this one, but all of them use one material only. All of them try to work with one principal detail. They're all kind of optimized to the last bit. The floor plans are squeezed out to the last square centimeter, and so on, and so on, and so on. I mean, you have to fulfill these regulations to get your fundings and all that. I spare you the details on that. But anyway, I mean, the thing is that we try to work with one thing in one house, and that we do from concept to realization, from big scale to small scale, from inside to outside. This is simply where we think we can add something of value to the debate of affordable housing, kind of its architectural limitation. Last project I'm going to quickly run through is a project that is done by a developer. The project you just saw in Leiden is pretty much the end of an economic boom. An economic boom we had for at least 15 years, if not 20 years, in the Netherlands. It was a very optimistic time. Everything was realized. You just sketched it and they grabbed it out of your hand and just started constructing it. A little bit, maybe, it reminds me of China today in a mini scale, but very, very optimistic time. Today, the total opposite. We are facing the biggest depression since World War II. The recession is tremendous. The unemployment rate under architects has risen from 8% 3 years ago to over 60% today. That indicates a little bit what we're talking about. So if you're going to apply somewhere, just go east, not west, okay? This is a project that tries to find a solution how to build in times of crisis. Since there's one little town in the province of Zeeland, the southernmost province of the Netherlands, that has a little growing curve. a positive growing curve. And the city decided to actually push that by making a super big development here, well, just down on the downside of the image is the old city, and kind of giving up the port, since Antwerp and Rotterdam have taken over the economical predominancy anyway, and the port area is going to be transformed in a sort of new town development. Once that area was one of the wealthiest areas in Europe. Golden Age, 17th century, salt trading, Piet Hein. I mean, all these guys, the big explorers, the Dutch explorers of that time, they kind of started in either in Goes or in other little towns around that area. And today, big question mark. What are we going to do? We cannot stop. I mean, we have to develop something. So we were approached by a developer with the Chile project and said, well, you guys did that project in Chile, why don't you do the same here? And we said, hang on, I mean, you're a developer. We did, was the success. So you get out and, we can talk about it. Well, that was not an option really. But he came up with a plan by West 8, by Adrian Geuze, and Adrian Geuze is very much of that kind of sort of splitting up urban planning idea. And he decided to actually put three architects together, target groups. Low income, middle income, high income. In the neighborhood, socially balanced, the wet ones were our developments, and guess what? We got the minimum income group. Surprise, surprise. And what did we do? We kind of thought the only chance, we have to develop a catalogus. We have to come up with a sort of optional ideas that people could choose a basic house, they can extend it, they can build on top, they can extend it to the backyard, they can add windows, and so on. And that idea ended up in something which would have the financial limit of 880 euros a square meter. That is a price, I don't know, we thought, we can stop here. This is ridiculous. We're never going to make this. Why? Because of that urban plan. I mean, that urban plan is maybe a nice idea, but it totally works against any kind of repetition. I mean, three architects, you always connect to the left or the right with another special detail. This totally doesn't make sense to us in the beginning. And we decided, okay, let's try it with a very rigid structure of a house. Very simple. We choose the cheapest brick we could find. Just make sure it's dark. Towards the materialization. And, brick is the cheapest material you get in the Netherlands. It's very, very cost efficient. And then work out a catalogus where people could choose 2 floors and a roof, 2 floors, no roof or flat roof, 3 floors, 3rd floor over the full depth of the house or just a half, and so on, and so on. What stayed the same was actually the principal detailing and the materialization. And what you see here is part of that option that actually these panels could be easily removed and replaced by windows, so people could actually start with a low budget version, and whilst they're having economic success of the future 15 years, they kind of remove that panel and replace it by a window or make an extension to the roof. Now, all these restrictions, they forced us, obviously, that was our ambition, to not totally fall behind the quality of the houses our neighbors did, because that was our architectural panic we had, right? I mean, they had almost twice, the highest income group had almost twice the budget we had, and we thought, it's a bit unfair, no? I mean, we're not. I mean, in the end, they try to make everyone the same, but actually the starting conditions is like very, very unequal. And so these were our principles. We really kind of fought for the deep recessed windows, for that one detail we fought for the maximum surface of glass from floor to ceiling. Actually, the only houses this, funny enough. And we fought for own entrance doors. Every unit has its own, like, entrance door on ground floor, no apartment buildings. And some of these interesting little details. And this is how it ended up, like the very, very first street just finished. And actually, I think if you look at the houses, you see these, and you see that's the middle category here. And I think, no, there's no of the highest category on this image. But anyway, if you see the image, you kind of get an idea that, okay, it may go along pretty much okay. What does it mean in floor plans? Again, there's no square centimeter lost. This is the much standardized Dutch floor plan you will find all over the country. You know, I'm not talking about moving a wall 5 centimeter. I'm talking about conceptually different typologies. Prefabricated staircase, prefabricated roof. Maybe you've seen these roofs. They have roof construction with hinges, right? So they'll be prefabricated in a timber workshop. They're put down by crane. They kind of fold them open, put them on the walls, and that's it. That sort of construction methods we had. And then we had options to that, 2 and 3, and variations within the same family. I'm quickly going to go into one detail here because it shows the dilemma we're actually talking about. Well, it's not very good to see, but you see that this is actually a timber frame construction. So the house you see is actually fake. You know, we're trying to build something here that actually we could not afford to build. A massive brick house like it used to be 300 years ago. And the funny part is, and maybe that's something we can bring into the debate later on, that my statement would be that the initial building costs we need to build affordable housing is probably very much irrelevant. What's much more important, at least in the debates we had with our client, with our contractor, is the cost. Because people will have to be able to maintain the building over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And if you talk about this, then the little crucial details, like brick being the most cost-efficient building material, it's cheaper than the timber facade, this brick. And it's low maintenance cost, right? So this has one initial cost, whereas if you do a timber house, you have an initial starting cost adding yearly up by maintenance costs over the next 20 years. I start with a little blink to the history. Why do we have these Pons aluminium trays? Because, you know, we were pretty much charmed by the old costumes of that region and the wealth there was during the salt trading times, and that was actually one of the little gadgets. It's a gadget, right? But it was one of the gadgets where we tried to kind of push our houses a bit up towards the ones of Schulz and VHP, the two other offices that we were working with on that project. Okay, and this is where I'm going to end. Thanks a lot.